Thank you, Lucy Hockings there. This is Impact. Australia's just marked the 3rd anniversary of a historic moment, the government's formal apology for past wrongs to the Indigenous Aboriginal population. On that day in 2008, this is what the then Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said in Parliament.
It's time to say sorry. It's time to move forward together. To the stolen generations, I say the following. As Prime Minister of Australia, I am sorry. On behalf of the Government of Australia, I am sorry. On behalf of the Parliament of Australia, I am sorry. And I offer you this apology without qualification.
Well, the term stolen generation refers to the many thousands of Aboriginal children forcibly removed from their families. But 3 years on, Australia's treatment of its Indigenous population remains an issue, and it's the subject of a new documentary called Our Generation that's making its London debut. Here's part of the trailer.
Government will seize control of Aboriginal townships and access to lands will be opened up.
Every single one of them has pedophiles operating in them. Now that is a national emergency.
We believe that this government is using child sexual abuse as the Trojan horse to resume total control of our lands.
That's the most important aspect of our life. We are connected to our land.
This is what they call a lucky country, but not so lucky up here.
Well, the filmmakers Damien Curtis and Sinem Sabana with me here in the studio. Thanks for coming in, both of you. Sinem Sabana, I think you spent considerable time working with Aboriginal communities and observing them, but what was it that got you interested in this particular part of Australia?
I'd first gone out to Arnhem Land 10 years ago, initially as a school teacher, and then having spent time outside of the community, I was actually witnessing firsthand the living conditions, the health conditions, and in general the human rights violations that Aborigines were experiencing. And then in 2007 the Howard government announced the intervention, and that was almost the icing on the cake for me, and I felt compelled to make this film.
Damien, you were also working on the film, but you were also able to compare it to Indigenous peoples elsewhere in the world.
That's right. I'd been working with NGOs supporting other Indigenous communities in the Amazon and in Africa on their land rights and their rights to their territories against mining companies and other interests. So there is definitely a global perspective that is in this film, and this film tells of a story that is paralleled in other parts of the world with Indigenous peoples.
And land is at the very heart of it. Essentially, the argument you're making in the film is that people are being deprived of their land.
That's right. A big thrust of what's happening in current Indigenous policy is moving Aboriginal people off their lands. And a big component of current legislation is this Northern Territory intervention, which was supposed to address child abuse in Aboriginal communities 3 years ago, but instead has done nothing to improve the well-being of children, but has all been about changes in land tenure. And there's other policies such as Working Futures up in the Northern Territory that's aimed at centralising Aboriginal people off their lands into the bigger townships. So there's a big interest in getting Aboriginal people off their lands.
Sinem, are you actually saying that the primary purpose of the Australian government in these interventions is to take the land?
I believe so. I mean, if you look at the policies since the intervention, you have the Northern Territory intervention, you have the Homelands policy. Nothing about these legislation actually talks about children, the well-being of children. So this sensationalised issue back in 2007 about pedophilia is actually now ignored. So we're asking, what is going on? What is this legislation about?
Well, we put some of the allegations that are made in your documentary to the government department that's responsible for all of this in Canberra. And essentially on the point about the land, they say that they require these long leases in order to, unless they have some kind of security over the land, they can't put in roads, they can't provide medical services, they can't set up schools.
Unfortunately, the situation with this is that they're actually bribing people. So basic services that every Australian enjoys, including myself, such as access to health, housing and education, is actually being bribed for. So people have to sign leases on their land to access basic citizenship rights. That's where the suspicion lays.
Well, they're saying actually, and Damien, I wonder if you could respond to this, essentially they're saying that all of this is necessary to make sure the services run properly. And on the point you raise about access to mines in the land, they say that that's a completely different issue, that if you allow the government to use your land for services, that doesn't mean that it gives the government the power over access to any minerals.
Well, there's other ways to provide services and to actually have to take leases over land that actually Aboriginal people have spent 30 years campaigning for and have been granted to them under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. And finally, they've been gaining recognition of their ownership over their traditional lands. To have that taken away so that they're provided with services they should be entitled to as other Australians.
You call it taken away. Couldn't you also make an argument, though, that this is all about the integration of the Aboriginal people, that for too long they've been left outside the mainstream Australian community?
I think this is actually part of the problem, is that mainstream Australia, including government, believes that the solution to Aboriginal problems, the epidemic health crisis, the overcrowding, is actually can be met by mainstreaming Aboriginal people. That's actually part of the problem, which the government refuses to understand, is that our solutions are actually Indigenous people's problems. By bringing them into the mainstream, we're actually having a huge detrimental impact onto their lives. They're not used to our lifestyle. They don't live in a Western society. They never had money. They never lived in houses.
Okay.
You know, and this is...
Sinem Saban, I wish we had more time, but thank you both. The film is called Our Generation and it's making its London debut today. Thank you.
Thank you
for coming in.